The copper tang of blood in Elias's mouth was the only thing keeping him awake as the 4 a.m. alarm shrieked like a banshee. He had bitten his tongue in his sleep, a recurring byproduct of the night terrors that visited him whenever the rent was due. He sat on the edge of a mattress that sagged toward the floor, his joints popping with the sound of dry kindling. His right hand started its morning ritual, a rhythmic, violent tremor that made his fingers look like they were trying to escape his wrist. He gripped his forearm with his left hand, squeezing until the pain dulled the shaking. He couldn't afford a nervous system that didn't obey him. Not today. Today was the anniversary of the day the world stopped turning, and his children were walking landmines of grief. The house of paper walls, the hallway of the small rented craftsman on the edge of the industrial district smelled of damp wool and lingering wood smoke. Elias moved like a ghost, avoiding the floorboards he knew would groan. He stopped at the first door. Leo was sprawling across his twin bed, one arm hanging off the side. At 16 he was already taller than Elias, a lean silhouette of potential and simmering resentment. His room was a fortress of discarded hoodies and headphones. Elias watched the steady rise and fall of his son's chest, aching to reach out and brush the hair from the boy's forehead, but he knew better. To Leo, Elias's touch was no longer a comfort. It was a reminder of everything they had lost: the stability, the suburban house with the yard, the mother who used to sing him to sleep. In the next room, Maya was already awake. He saw the sliver of light beneath her door. She was 12, but she lived with the hypervigilance of a combat veteran. He pushed the door open an inch. She was sitting at her small desk, meticulously sewing a fallen strap back onto Toby's backpack. "You should be sleeping, May," Elias whispered. She didn't look up, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "The bus comes early, Dad, and Toby gets upset if his stuff isn't right. You know that." The guilt hit Elias in the solar plexus. Maya hadn't asked for a new backpack in 3 years. She hadn't asked for anything. She had simply stepped into the vacuum left by her mother, assuming the role of the household's silent engine while Elias worked himself into a shadow. "I've got the morning shift," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "There's bread for toast. I'll be back by 6. Don't forget your brace," she said, her voice flat. "Your hand was bad last night." She was 12. She shouldn't be tracking the frequency of his tremors. Finally, he checked on Toby. The 7-year-old was curled into a ball, clutching a stuffed rabbit that was missing an eye. Toby was the only one who still looked at Elias with pure, unadulterated hope, which made the secret in Elias's pocket feel even heavier. The eviction notice. Final warning. 3 days. The shipyard purgatory. The air at the port of Tacoma was a frozen mist of salt and diesel. Elias spent his hours in the belly of rusted giants container ships that looked like floating cities. Before the cancer took Sarah, before the medical bills gutted their savings, Elias had been a master carpenter. He had worked with cherry, walnut, and teak, creating furniture that felt like poetry. Now, he hauled scrap metal. He spent 8 hours in a deafening cacophony of grinding steel. The vibrations of the heavy machinery were an agony for his neurological condition, a slow-acting poison that exacerbated the palsy in his hands. By noon, his right hand was useless, tucked into the pocket of his greasy coveralls. Hey Miller, his foreman, a man named Henderson with skin like cured leather, barked over the roar of a crane. "You're lagging. Get those beams moved to the crusher or clock out." "I don't pay for statues." Elias gritted his teeth, his muscles screaming. He took a heavy chain, wrapping it around a jagged piece of steel. As he pulled, a sharp edge sliced through his work glove, biting deep into the meat of his palm. He didn't yell. He didn't even hiss. He just watched the blood dark and thick blot, the orange fabric of his glove. He thought of the fruit bowl on the kitchen table. He thought of Toby's missing eye rabbit. He pulled harder. "I'm on it," Elias shouted back, the salt air stinging the new wound. The kitchen table wore. By the time Elias climbed the porch steps at 5:45 p.m., the sun was a bruised purple smudge on the horizon. His body felt like a bruised peach, soft and ready to collapse. Inside the house was a theater of domestic tension. The smell of cheap, boiling pasta filled the air, the poor man's feast they had eaten 4 times this week. Elias stood at the sink, washing the shipyard grease from his skin. The water turned a murky gray, swirling down the drain. He looked in the cracked mirror above the basin. He was 42, but the man looking back had the eyes of an octogenarian. His skin was sallow, his hair thinning, and his jaw was set in a permanent clench. Dinner, Maya called. They sat in their usual spots. The table was a cheap laminate thing they'd found on a curb, a far cry from the hand-carved oak table Elias had built for Saratha, one he'd been forced to sell to pay for her funeral. "I have a soccer meeting tomorrow," Leo said, stabbing a noodle with his fork. "There's a fee for the jersey. $50. Elias felt the air leave the room. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the eviction notice. "I don't have it, Leo. Not this week." Leo slammed his fork down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "You never have it. Every time I ask for something, anything, it's the same speech. Not this week. Next month, maybe. Do you even care?" "Leo, stop," Maya whispered, her eyes darting between them. "No, I'm tired of stopping." Leo stood up, his chair screeching against the linoleum. "Look at this place. We live in a dump, we eat garbage, and you just sit there shaking like you're scared of the world. Mom would be ashamed of what you've let happen to us." Elias's hand erupted. The tremor was so violent that his water glass rattled against the table, the liquid slopping over the side. He tried to hide it under the table, but Toby was staring, his mouth open, a piece of plain pasta halfway to his lips. "Your father is doing his best," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't refer to himself as I. He felt too detached from his own identity for that. "Your best isn't enough," Leo yelled. "You're not even here. You're just a ghost that brings home grease and excuses." Leo stormed out, the front door slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. Toby started to cry, a quiet, shivering sound. Maya immediately moved to his side, pulling him into her lap. She looked at Elias, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that terrified him more than the eviction notice. It wasn't anger. It was pity. "I'll handle him, Dad," she said softly. "Go lie down. You're shaking so hard you're going to break the chair." The ghost in the fruit bowl. Later that night, after the kids were supposedly asleep, Elias sat alone in the dark kitchen. The only light came from the buzzing street lamp outside. He reached under the fruit bowl. He pulled out the eviction notice and laid it on the table. Beside it, he placed a letter from the University of Washington, the one he had kept hidden for nearly 2 decades. He ran his scarred, trembling thumb over the embossed seal of the university. This letter represented the man he used to be, a man with steady hands and a vision for beauty. A man who thought he could build a world out of wood and love. He looked at the eviction notice. 72 hours to vacate. He wasn't just a broken father. He was a man running out of places to hide his brokenness. He leaned his head into his hands and, for the first time since the funeral, let the silence of the house swallow him whole. He didn't see the shadow in the doorway. He didn't see Maya standing there, her eyes fixing on the yellowed envelope of the university letter. He just sat there, a master of nothing, waiting for the floor to finally give way. The silence in the house following Leo's outburst wasn't a peaceful one. It was a pressurized, suffocating weight. For 3 days, Elias existed on the periphery of his own life. He woke before the sun, returned after it set, and avoided the kitchen table, the site of his public fracturing. The tremor in his hand had migrated to his shoulder, a constant, buzzing reminder of the stress of the impending eviction. He had 3 days to find a miracle, or they would be living out of his rusted 2004 pickup truck. He spent his breaks at the shipyard scouring Craigslist for under-the-table work, his vision blurring as he scrolled through ads he was no longer physically capable of answering. Back at the house, the atmosphere had shifted from cold to clinical. Maya was the one who orchestrated it. She was a child who had learned to read the barometer of a room before she learned her multiplication tables. She saw the way her father's eyes glazed over, the way he stopped eating his own portion of the pasta to leave more for Toby. She also saw the shoebox. The discovery, it happened on a Thursday afternoon. The sky over the industrial district was a flat, oppressive gray that threatened rain but never delivered. Toby was at a friend's house, a rare mercy, and Leo was in the garage, kicking a deflated soccer ball against the wall with a rhythmic, angry thud, dash thud, dash thud. Maya was in Elias's room. She hadn't gone in there to pry. She had gone in to find a needle and thread. Toby had ripped the strap of his backpack again, and she was determined to fix it before he noticed. She knew her father kept a small sewing kit in his top drawer, a relic from her mother's time. When she opened the drawer, The scent of cedar and Old Spice hit her so hard she had to steady herself against the dresser. It was the smell of before. She moved a stack of mismatched socks and found it, a tattered heavy cardboard shoebox, bound by a fraying rubber band. It felt heavy, not with weight, but with intent. "Maya, what are you doing in there?" She jumped, her heart hammering. Leo was leaning against the doorframe, his face sweaty, his expression guarded. "I was looking for the kit," she whispered, holding the box like a holy relic. "But I found this." Leo walked in, his cynicism momentarily overruled by curiosity. He sat on the edge of the saggy bed. "Open it." "We shouldn't. It's Dad's." "Dad doesn't have secrets," Leo scoffed. "He has bills and headaches. Just open it." Maya snapped the rubber band. It perished instantly, crumbling into dry red dust. Inside, the box wasn't filled with money or jewelry. It was filled with paper. At the very top was the letter Elias had been clutching in the dark, the University of Washington acceptance. But beneath it was a trove of history they didn't recognize. There were blueprints, hand-drawn, intricate, and beautiful. They weren't just sketches. They were technical masterpieces. A dining table with a butterfly joinery that looked like it belonged in a museum. A rocking chair with a spine so ergonomic it looked like it could breathe. "Wait," Leo said, his voice dropping an octave. He pulled out a photograph. It was a man. He was young, his hair thick and messy, his face glowing with a kind of joy they had never seen on their father. He was standing in a sun-drenched workshop, covered in sawdust, his arm draped around a woman whose laugh was frozen in time. Sarah. But it was the man's hands that caught Leo's attention. They were wrapped around the handle of a chisel, steady as stone, powerful and graceful. "That's him," Maya whispered. "That's Dad. He looks happy," Leo said, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. They dug deeper. They found the letters. There were dozens of them, all addressed to Sarah, written while Elias was working 3 different jobs in a different city to save for their first home. "I know the shipyard is loud, Sarah, and the air smells like burnt hair and salt, but every time I swing a hammer I'm thinking of the grain of the white oak I'm going to buy. I'm going to build us a life that doesn't creak. I'm going to build a table where our children will sit, and they will never have to worry about the floor falling out from under them." Maya felt a tear hit the paper. "He did it for us," she said. "He was going to be an artist, Leo. He had a fellowship. He could have been famous. Then why is he hauling scrap metal?" Leo's voice was jagged. "Why are we losing the house?" Maya found the last letter. It was dated 20 years ago, 2 weeks after the university letter. It wasn't to Sarah. It was a carbon copy of a letter to the dean of the fellowship. "I must respectfully decline the offer. My father has left, and I am the only one capable of supporting my younger siblings and my ailing mother. There is no one else to work the docks. Maybe in another life, I will find the wood again. For now I must find the strength." The silence in the room became deafening. The thud-thud of the soccer ball was gone. In its place was the realization of a 20-year sacrifice that had never ended. The confrontation. The front door creaked open. Elias was home early. Leo didn't hide the box. He stood up, clutching the photograph of the young, sawdust-covered Elias, and walked into the kitchen. Maya followed, her face pale. Elias was standing by the sink, his back to them. He was trying to open a jar of pickles, but his right hand was failing him. The jar rattled against the counter, a pathetic, rhythmic clinking that filled the room. "You didn't go because of Grandpa," Leo said. Elias froze, his shoulders bunched up toward his ears. Slowly he turned around. When he saw the shoebox in Maya's hands and the photo in Leo's, his face didn't register anger. It registered a total, devastating defeat. "Put that back," he said, his voice a ghost of itself. "You gave up everything," Maya said, her voice trembling. "The fellowship, the art, the workshop. You stayed at the docks for 20 years so your brothers could go to school. And then you stayed for us." "It was my job," Elias snapped, the palsy in his hand worsening as he reached for the photo. "It's what a man does. You take the weight. You don't talk about it. You just carry it." "But look at you, Dad," Leo shouted, stepping into his father's space. "You're carrying it until you're breaking. You think you're being a hero by hiding this, but you're lonely. You've been alone in this house even when we're standing right here." I have work to do, Elias said, trying to push past them. No, Leo said, blocking the exit. You don't have work, you have us, and we're tired of watching you die in slow motion. Leo held up the technical drawing of the butterfly joint table. You told Mom you'd build a life that didn't creak. Well, it's creaking, Dad. It's falling apart. But not because we're poor. It's because you stopped being the man in this picture. You stopped being a creator and started being a ghost. Elias looked at the drawing. He looked at the steady, confident lines he had drawn when he was 22. Then he looked at his hand, the hand that currently couldn't even grip a pickle jar. I can't do that anymore, Leo, Elias whispered, and for the first time he let the tears fall. They carved tracks through the shipyard soot on his cheeks. My hands, they don't listen to me. I'm broken. I can't build anything for you. Then let us help you, Maya said, reaching out to take his trembling hand in hers. She didn't flinch at the shaking. She held it tight, anchoring him. You don't have to carry the wood alone anymore. The cold truth, the emotional breakthrough, was shattered by a sharp rap at the door. Elias wiped his face with his sleeve, the mask of the stoic father slamming back into place. He opened the door to find a man in a tan suit holding a clipboard. Mr. Miller, I'm from the property management group. I'm just here to confirm the walkthrough for Monday morning at 8 a.m. The man looked past Elias into the cramped, cluttered kitchen. He saw the pasta on the stove, the shoebox on the table, and the two teenagers standing like guards. We're not leaving, Leo said, stepping forward. The man sighed, a sound of practiced indifference. Kid, the notice was served. The back rent hasn't been paid. Mr. Miller, if the premises aren't vacated, the sheriff will be here by noon on Monday. I suggest you start packing tonight. He handed Elias a final piece of paper, a bright red notice of possession, and walked back to his car without a second glance. Elias looked at the red paper. The weight he had been carrying for 20 years suddenly felt like it had finally crushed his spine. He leaned against the doorframe, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged wheeze. Dad, Toby's voice came from the hallway. He had just been dropped off. He was holding his stuffed rabbit, his eyes wide as he looked at the red paper in his father's hand. Are we going on a trip? Elias couldn't answer. He couldn't lie anymore. No, Toby, Leo said, his voice surprisingly steady. He walked over and picked his little brother up, looking Elias straight in the eyes. We're going to the garage. All of us. Leo, there's nothing in the garage but junk, Elias muttered. No, Leo replied, his jaw set with the same iron resolve his father had used for 2 decades. There's a workbench in there, and there's enough scrap oak in the corner to build something. You said you couldn't build anything alone, so don't. Into the sawdust. The garage was a tomb of forgotten dreams. It was filled with rusted lawnmowers, boxes of Sarah's old clothes, and a heavy cast-iron workbench Elias hadn't touched since the day of the diagnosis. The air was thick with the smell of motor oil and stagnation. Leo and Maya began to clear the junk. They worked with a frantic, desperate energy, tossing aside broken plastic and old newspapers until the workbench stood naked in the center of the room. Elias stood in the doorway, the notice of possession still crumpled in his hand. He felt like an intruder in his own life. The palsy was humming in his arm, a cruel vibration that mockingly mimicked the power tools he used to love. What are we doing? Elias asked. You're going to teach me how to use the chisel, Leo said, holding up the tool. It was dull and spotted with rust, and Maya is going to sand the boards. And Toby is going to be the foreman. Leo, we have 3 days. We need money, not a hobby. We're not making a hobby. Dad, Leo said, his eyes burning. We're making the butterfly table. The one from the drawing. The one you promised Mom. I can't hold a chisel, Leo. Look at me, Elias roared, thrusting his shaking hand into the light of the single overhead bulb. Leo didn't look away. He walked over, took his father's shaking hand, and placed it on the handle of the tool. Then, he placed his own large, steady hand over his father's. I'll be your hands. Dad, you just be the eyes. Elias looked at his son. He saw the man Leo was becoming, a man built out of the very sacrifice Elias had tried to hide. He felt the warmth of his son's grip, a steadying force that slowed the tremor just enough. For the first time in years, Elias Miller didn't look at the clock. He didn't look at the eviction notice. He looked at the wood, Get the oil, Elias whispered, his voice cracking, and the sharpening stone. If we're going to build this, we're going to build it right. As the first sparks of the sharpening stone hit the air, the broken father began to fade. The four of them stood in the dim light of the garage, a small island of creation in a sea of encroaching darkness, ready to fight for their lives with nothing but sawdust and the truth. The rain finally came on Saturday night, a relentless Pacific Northwest deluge that hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the garage inside. The world was reduced to the radius of a single, flickering halogen work light. The butterfly table was no longer a sketch. It was a skeleton of reclaimed white oak, rising from the sawdust like a ghost reclaiming its skin. Elias stood behind Leo, his chest pressed against his son's back. This was the only way it worked. Leo held the heavy mallet and the wood chisel, but Elias's shaking hands were wrapped firmly over Leo's knuckles. It was a strange, intimate dance. Elias would feel the grain of the wood through Leo's skin, whispering directions. Left 2 millimeters, angle it down. Now strike, lightly like you're tapping a window. Crack a perfect curl of oak peeled away, revealing the intricate housing for the butterfly joinery. Elias breathed in the scent of the wood, tannic, ancient, and sharp was the smell of a life he had tried to bury. You're doing it, Dad, Leo whispered, his own sweat dripping onto the workbench. We're doing it, Elias corrected. The midnight hour by Sunday at 2 a.m., the physical toll was becoming visible. Maya was asleep on a pile of moving blankets in the corner, her fingers stained gray from hours of hand sanding the underside of the tabletop. Toby was curled up beside her, still clutching his one-eyed rabbit, his small face peaceful despite the roar of the storm outside. Elias's legs were buckling. The shipyard shift from Friday felt like it had happened in a different century, but the exhaustion was a physical weight pressing on his spine. His palsy had reached a fever pitch. His entire right side was a vibrating mass of nerves. Sit down, Dad, Leo said, wiping grease and sawdust from his forehead. I can finish the sanding. No, Elias said, his voice a gravelly rasp. The joinery has to be perfect. If the butterfly isn't seated right, the whole table will split when the wood expands. It's the tension that holds it together. Leo, the tension is the strength. He looked at the piece of wood in his hand, a small, bounty-shaped wedge of dark walnut that would bridge the crack in the oak slab. It was a beautiful metaphor he didn't have the energy to vocalize. The crack was the grief, the poverty, the loss of Sarah. The butterfly was them. Why this table? Leo asked suddenly, his voice quiet so as not to wake the others. You could have built something simpler, something we could sell fast. Elias looked at the walnut, because this was the one she wanted. Your mother saw the sketch and said, Elias, that's not a table. That's a promise. I never got to give it to her. I thought if I built it now, maybe the promise would still count. Leo looked at his father not as the broken man who couldn't pay the rent, but as the architect of their survival. It counts, Dad. The final stand Monday morning arrived with the cold, sterile light of a winter dawn. The house was packed into cardboard boxes, most of them half empty. The living room was a graveyard of their history. But in the center of the garage stood the table. It was a 6-foot slab of quarter-sawn white oak, the grain flowing like a frozen river. 2 dark walnut butterflies were inlaid across a natural fissure in the wood, their edges so seamless they looked as if they had grown there. The base was a series of complex, hand-cut trestles that gave the massive piece of wood the illusion of floating. It was, quite simply, the finest thing Elias had ever created. At 8:05 a.m., a black SUV pulled into the gravel driveway. It wasn't the property manager. It was a man named Julian Vane, a high-end furniture scout Leo had found on Instagram 3 days ago and spammed with photos of the process. Behind Vane came the property manager and a deputy sheriff. Mr. Miller, the property manager said, stepping out of his car and checking his watch. I see the truck isn't loaded. We discussed this. Elias didn't look at him. He was standing by the table, a damp cloth in his shaking hand, rubbing one last coat of tung oil into the grain. Julian Vane walked past the deputy and entered the garage. The air in the room changed. Vane was a man who dealt in five-figure dining sets for tech moguls in Seattle. He walked around the table twice, his eyes narrowed, his gloved fingers tracing the butterfly joinery. He didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the rain dripping from the eaves. "Who cut these joints?" Vane asked, his voice low. "I did," Leo said, stepping forward. "Under my father's direction." Vane looked at Elias, at the grease-stained coveralls, the trembling hand, the exhausted eyes. Then he looked back at the table. "The tension is perfect," Vane muttered. "Most people use glue to cheat. You didn't use a drop of glue on the structural joints, did you? Wood shouldn't need glue to stay together if it respects the man who cut it," Elias said, his voice finding a forgotten strength. Vane turned to the property manager. "How much is the debt on this house?" The manager blinked, confused. "It's, with back rent and legal fees, about $7,000. Vane turned back to Elias. "I'll give you $12,000 for the table right now. I have a client in Medina who has been waiting 2 years for a piece with this kind of soul." The silence that followed was broken by Toby, who let out a small muffled cheer from behind Maya's legs. Elias looked at the table. He looked at the walnut butterflies, the promise to Sarah. He felt the weight of the last 12 months, the hunger, the shame, the fear of the dark. "No," Elias said. Leo gasped. "Dad, what are you doing?" Elias looked at Julian Vane. "The table isn't for sale." "Not that one. That's for my children. That's our kitchen table." The property manager stepped forward, his face reddening. "Mr. Miller, you are being evicted. You can't keep a $12,000 table and live in a house you don't pay for." "I'm not finished," Elias said, turning to Vane. "I can't sell you that table, but I can build you 5 more. My son has the hands, I have the eyes. We're opening Miller & Sons Custom Woodworking. If you want to commission the first 3 pieces, I'll take a deposit today that covers the rent." Vane looked at the table again. He looked at the bond between the man and the boy. He smiled a real, appreciative smile. "A deposit for 3 pieces at $6,000 each," Vane said, reaching for his checkbook. "But I want them exactly like this. Real, no glue." The new grain, the deputy and the property manager left 30 minutes later. The red notice of possession crumpled in the mud of the driveway. The house was still old, the roof still leaked, Elias's hand still shook. But as the 4 of them sat around the butterfly table that evening, eating a meal that finally included fresh vegetables and roast chicken, the silence in the house was different. It wasn't the silence of things unsaid. It was the silence of a house that had been braced. Toby sat at the end, rubbing his hand over the smooth oiled wood. "It feels warm, Dad. That's the friction," Toby, Elias said, sitting at the head of the table. He didn't hide his hand under the table tonight. He let it rest on the oak, the tremor visible, a part of the landscape. When you build something right, it holds on to the heat of the people who made it. Leo looked at his father across the grain. The jagged edges of the boy's anger had been sanded down, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning pride. "What are we building tomorrow?" Elias looked at his children, his real masterpieces. He thought of the letter in the shoebox, the fellowship he had walked away from, and the life he had built instead. He realized then that he hadn't failed Sarah. He hadn't failed himself. He had simply been waiting for the wood to be ready. "Tomorrow," Elias said, his voice steady, even if his hands weren't. "We're going to build a bookshelf for Maya. She is going to need a place for all the books she is going to read at university." Maya beamed, her eyes shining in the soft light of the kitchen. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the house of Elias Miller, the floor stopped creaking. They were no longer a family held together by duct tape and desperation. They were held together by the tension of their love, a bond that, like the butterfly joint, only grew stronger the harder the world tried to pull it apart. Elias reached out and took Leo's hand on one side and Maya's on the other. For the first time in 20 years, the man who had been broken felt entirely, beautifully whole.